They say the wilderness is full of secrets, but some secrets are alive, watching, and far larger than anything you've ever imagined. From hunters stalked and torn apart in a remote Appalachian forest to a mountaineering team scattered across a Himalayan ridge, in this video, you'll witness 6 terrifying encounters with a creature that moves with deadly intelligence, striking when humans least expect it. The dense Appalachian Forest had always been a place where hunters tested both their patience and their courage, and when 4 men from Kentucky set out on October 12, 2014, they carried themselves with the confidence of experience, certain that they could handle the rugged terrain and whatever the wild might place before them. The air carried the bite of early autumn, a cool dampness rising from the forest floor. And while the men spoke little as they moved deeper into the trees, there was a sense among them that this trip, remote and demanding, would deliver the kind of game they sought, far from the crowded hunting grounds closer to home. They hiked for hours, leaving behind any signs of roads or cabins, the trail narrowing until it was only a faint suggestion between thickets and ancient oaks. And when they finally chose a place to set camp, the ground was soft with pine needles, and the forest pressed close on every side. Their tents went up quickly, a fire was coaxed into life, and their rifles rested within reach, the forest unusually quiet as evening crept over the ridges. The hunters settled in for the night, confident, prepared, and certain that whatever stirred in those woods could be tracked and taken. But by dawn, the campsite bore the look of something ripped apart by violence, so sudden and merciless that little about the scene made sense, even to men accustomed to wild animals and the chaos they could create. 3 of the hunters lay dead, their tents shredded like paper, their packs torn open and scattered across the ground, and the fire pit itself smashed into the dirt as though something massive had stomped straight through it. The bodies showed terrible blunt force trauma, bones crushed beneath heavy blows, boots torn away, and clothing ripped open in ragged strips. Yet there were no bite marks, no tearing of flesh consistent with bear or wolf, only the brutal evidence of sheer power delivered by something that had struck again and again with speed. Only 1 man survived, though when he stumbled from the trees hours later, he was scarcely recognizable as the steady, seasoned hunter his companions had known. His face was streaked with blood, his arms scraped and bruised, his expression distant, and his words broken, muttered fragments that told of something no one wanted to believe. He spoke of a towering figure with hair as black as the forest shadows, a creature that moved with frightening purpose, circling the camp before unleashing its attack, each exhalation a guttural sound that shook the ground as much as the men's nerves. He said the thing had come without hesitation, striking with hands so massive that bodies were thrown like rag dolls, and he remembered nothing after the first crushing blow, only waking to silence, destruction, and the empty eyes of his companions who had not survived. Rangers discovered him wandering along a faint trail, his clothes torn and stiff with dried blood, his voice trembling as he tried to explain what had happened, though the story unraveled in fragments that few could follow. They brought him to safety, treated his wounds, and attempted to piece together a coherent account of the night's violence. But the man's description was so unlike anything they had heard that they quickly began to suspect trauma had distorted his memory. When officials examined the camp, they saw the shredded tents, the broken packs, the bodies marked by force so extreme that bones had splintered, and they concluded that a bear, perhaps disoriented, perhaps enraged, had charged through in the night and slaughtered the hunters before vanishing back into the trees. Yet those who studied the ground found footprints around the camp, impressions sunk deep into the earth, larger than any black bear that roamed the Appalachians, and far too long in shape to be mistaken for clawed paws. The tracks circled the camp deliberately, as though the creature had watched the men before it struck, and while some rangers dismissed the prints as distorted or exaggerated, locals who heard about the details whispered a different conclusion. In towns bordering that stretch of forest, the story spread quickly, repeated in hushed tones, each telling adding weight to the survivors' broken testimony, each version reinforcing the belief that the hunters had encountered something that was not a bear. not anything that could be measured against ordinary wildlife. The survivor himself never returned to the woods. His hunting days ended in that single night of terror. Friends said he remained haunted, waking in the small hours drenched in sweat, muttering about the sound of heavy breathing in the dark and the memory of a massive figure circling a fire that crackled too low to keep the shadows at bay. He refused offers to hunt again, even in safer grounds, and the mere suggestion of camping under canvas brought visible fear to his face. His mind fixed forever on the night when 3 lives were lost to something he could not name without shaking. The official record closed quickly. The deaths attributed to a bear attack, tragic but not unprecedented in wild country. Yet among hunters, the story lingered, shared around fires and whispered at bars, always with the same detail that unsettled those who heard it. The bodies bore no bite marks, no tearing consistent with predation, only the crushing power of something that struck with fists, not claws. The footprints, too large and too human in shape, remained a detail left out of reports, but carried in memory by those who saw them before the ground softened with rain and erased what evidence remained. Years later, the site of the camp remained avoided, even by seasoned hunters who had spent their lives in those woods. Some said the forest had changed after that night, the silence heavier, the sense of being watched more oppressive, as though the trees themselves remembered what had passed beneath their branches. Few ventured into that stretch of wilderness, and those who did often cut their trips short, uneasy, unwilling to risk the same fate. What happened in the Appalachian Forest on that October night remained an open wound for those who knew the men, a story too strange to accept yet too detailed to dismiss, an account of destruction, loss, and terror that no explanation could fully satisfy, leaving behind only questions and the memory of footprints that suggested something far larger and far more deliberate than any bear. The summer camp had been built decades earlier on the edge of a vast Siberian forest, where the trees grew so thick that light seemed to vanish beneath the canopy, and where the wind carried a constant hush, as though the woods themselves wished to guard their secrets. Every year, children from surrounding towns were sent there, their days filled with games, swimming in the river, and hikes meant to teach them respect for nature, and the counselors encouraged long treks through the wilderness, confident in their ability to keep the groups together and safe. It was on July 23, 1996, during one of these hikes, that something happened which would change the camp forever. A single incident that still caused unease in villages miles away. The children had been led along a faint trail that cut deep into the forest, their laughter fading as the trees closed in and the distance from the cabins grew. By mid-afternoon, when the group turned back, a smaller cluster of children had strayed from the others, moving ahead on their own and losing sight of both counselors and campmates. When they finally returned to the cabins hours later, their clothes were torn by branches, their shoes caked in mud, and their faces pale with fear. They spoke of a towering figure that had stalked them in silence, moving between the trees with unsettling patience, always at the edge of sight yet never stepping fully into view. Some claimed it breathed heavily, the sound carrying across the forest like a muffled drumbeat, while others remembered only the shape, impossibly tall, outlined against the pale dusk. The counselors dismissed the tale, attributing it to nerves, fatigue, and the vivid imagination of children lost in a strange forest. They told them it was nothing more than shadows and the tricks of light, and reassured them that no one had followed. Yet the children remained restless that night, waking at the smallest sounds and glancing toward the tree line as though expecting the shadow to return. The next morning, despite unease, the camp schedule continued. Another hike was organized, leading the group back into the same part of the forest. It was meant to be a gesture of confidence, proof that nothing strange lurked in the trees. But before the day was over, the camp would be changed forever. One boy, no older than 9, failed to return with the others. At first, the counselors believed he had lagged behind, perhaps distracted or too tired to keep pace. But when the children insisted they had seen him walking ahead before vanishing into the trees, the concern turned quickly to panic. Search parties were formed immediately, counselors and older campers combing the trails with flashlights and calling into the night. But the boy, did not answer. Over the next several days, trained rescuers joined the search, their lines spreading wide through the forest, pushing deeper than most locals ever dared. They found no sign of the boy himself, but evidence of something else soon emerged, unsettling even to seasoned eyes. In a patch of mud where the ground held moisture from a receding snowdrift, they discovered enormous barefoot impressions pressed so deep that each step looked as though it carried the weight of a creature far beyond human size. The prints were longer than the boots of the tallest searcher, wide and distinct, each toe clearly marked. Nearby, in a small clearing, several saplings had been bent and broken, their trunks crushed as though by immense hands, and they were arranged in a rough circle that made no sense to those who studied it. The searchers stood in silence, staring at the strange formation, their unease growing as the forest around them fell quiet, the usual chatter of birds and insects absent as though even the wildlife avoided the place. Some whispered about what it might mean, while others insisted it was vandalism or a prank. Yet the sheer force required to break the young trees made that explanation difficult to accept. Despite these signs, the official investigation reached no extraordinary conclusion. Authorities claimed the boy had become lost and likely succumbed to exposure or an accident in the unforgiving terrain. They suggested the tracks were distorted human prints or the work of pranksters, and the crushed saplings were dismissed as irrelevant. The circle nothing more than coincidence. The camp closed for the season soon after, and while families grieved and demanded answers, nothing further was uncovered. The child remained missing, his disappearance written into the record as unsolved but presumed fatal. For the survivors of that summer, the memory of those days never faded. The children who had returned from the forest on the first hike grew into adults who still shuddered when asked about the towering shadow, their voices lowering as they spoke of the way it had watched them without sound, patient and deliberate, as though it knew they were intruding in a place where they did not belong. The counselors avoided speaking of it altogether, though some admitted privately that they had never been able to forget the size of the footprints or the unnatural silence of that clearing. In the years that followed, locals avoided the area near the camp, even those who had hunted and gathered there for generations. They spoke of being watched when they strayed too close, of shapes moving in the tree line that vanished when stared at directly, and of the sense that something immense and intelligent remained in those woods. Travelers occasionally reported strange sounds at night, heavy footsteps pacing just out of sight, and the sound of branches breaking as though a giant moved carefully among the trees. The camp itself fell into disuse, its cabins rotting slowly, swallowed by moss and vines. And though some visitors tried to revive it, the land seemed marked, carrying a reputation that no one wanted to confront. The disappearance of the boy in July 1996 remained unsolved, the official record silent on anything beyond accident or misadventure. But among locals, the truth was spoken more plainly. They believed the towering shadow was real, that it had followed the children from the tree line, and that when it chose to act, it had done so with purpose. On August 28, 2008, when the northern Minnesota evening stretched into long bands of red and gold across the water, Mark Ellison loaded a canoe with his teenage son Ryan, eager to show him one of the remote lakes he had discovered years before. The lake was far from the busy routes and campsites, ringed by heavy pines and scattered islands, its silence so complete that every paddle stroke echoed across the still surface. Mark had camped there in his younger days, confident in his knowledge of the land and its waters, and he wanted to share it with Ryan before autumn closed in. Neither could have guessed how the trip would end, or how the memory of it would follow them long after they returned home. The two paddled steadily into the fading light, the canoe gliding without effort as the air cooled and the tree line cast shadows across the water. Ryan dipped his paddle again and again until, without warning, he froze mid-stroke, his shoulders tightening as his eyes fixed on the surface beside the canoe. Mark followed his gaze and saw it too, something immense moving just beneath the water, keeping pace with their boat. The shape was wide and dark, its outline shifting but deliberate, gliding smoothly so that the water broke only in faint ripples. It was too large to be any muskie or pike that lived in those lakes, too controlled in its motion to be drifting timber. It traveled alongside them for what felt like long minutes, before darting suddenly beneath a small wooded island and disappearing from view. Father and son sat in silence, the canoe drifting, the air heavy with the kind of unease that made even the calmest waters feel threatening. When nothing resurfaced, Mark steered them toward shore, the long strokes of his paddle carrying an urgency he did not speak aloud, and the comfort of solid ground was a relief when they finally dragged the canoe onto the bank. The relief did not last long. As they reached their campsite, both noticed something strange in the sand and soil surrounding their gear. Nothing had been taken or disturbed. Their bags, food, and supplies all sat exactly as they had left them, but the sand bore a series of overlapping tracks that neither of them recognized. Faint depressions ran in circular patterns, as though something large had paced in arcs while waiting for their return. The circles were too precise to be the scatter of deer or small animals, and they seemed fresh, pressed deep enough that Ryan refused to step closer. Near the waterline, the ground grew darker with mud, and there the strangeness deepened. Imprinted clearly in the earth were several elongated, barefoot tracks, far larger than anything Mark had ever seen. The toes splayed and pressed with such force that each step had sunk inches into the wet soil. The prints led directly down to the water's edge, where they stopped, with no sign of any return. It was as if something massive had walked straight from the forest into the lake, leaving only silence behind. That night, neither man slept well. The forest around them seemed unnaturally still, the usual chorus of owls and insects absent, the air heavy with the sense of being watched. Mark sat awake long after Ryan had curled inside the tent, his eyes scanning the tree line, his hand resting near the lantern, the prints in the mud etched into his mind. Morning came slowly, and though no further disturbance showed around camp, the unease did not lift. When they returned to town and spoke cautiously of what they had seen, authorities gave their explanations quickly, unwilling to consider anything unusual. They said shadows on the water could be distorted by currents, that fear and fading light made shapes seem larger than they were, and that the footprints were either the result of erosion, boots slipping in mud, or the work of pranksters. The disturbed sand, they said, was nothing more than animal activity. Their conclusion was simple. There was nothing extraordinary to be found. But among locals, the account spread with different weight. In the small bars and bait shops around the region, whispers grew of enormous shadows gliding silently beneath the surface, of ripples that followed boats for long distances without a splash, and of nights when the water stirred as if something vast and alive had risen from its depths. Guides spoke quietly of fishermen who refused to cast after sunset, their memories unsettled by movements beneath the boat that did not belong to fish. And some told of footprints vanishing into the water, much like those Mark and Ryan had seen. The Ellisons never returned to that lake. Ryan, still young when it happened, carried the memory into adulthood with a quiet reluctance to fish at dusk, his unease showing whenever water turned dark under the last light of day. Mark, older and more practiced at keeping silent, admitted only once to friends that what unsettled him most was not the shadow gliding beneath the canoe, but the circles pressed into the sand, the evidence that whatever had passed by their camp had moved not as a beast of instinct, but with the patience of something aware, something willing to wait. On November 14, 2019, when the high ridges of Nepal were already cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes, a mountaineering team set out to scale a remote, isolated section of the Himalayas. Daniel Reiner, an experienced climber from Austria, led the expedition, accompanied by Marko Ilic, a seasoned Serbian alpinist, and Lukas Meyer, a German climber known for his precision on technical ascents. The men had spent years planning this climb, confident in their experience, equipment, and the meticulous route they had charted. They were joined by two Sherpas, Pemba Dorje and Tenzin Sherpa, whose knowledge of the mountain had saved countless climbers in the past, ensuring that the team had every advantage even in the unforgiving conditions. For the first 2 days, the climb progressed without incident. The team moved carefully but steadily, pitching tents each night on narrow ledges, the wind cutting across the slopes with a sharpness that left frost on their eyelashes. They spoke little, conserving energy, relying on glances and gestures to communicate, their senses attuned to every creak of ice and rumble of distant snow. Yet on the third day, when they were expected to check in via satellite phone, no signal came, and concern grew quickly. Rescue teams ascended the ridge in the following days, battling deep snow and treacherous overhangs to reach the last known position of the climbers. And what they discovered was shocking. Daniel, Marco, and Lucas were found scattered across a 100-meter stretch of ice and snow, their bodies positioned in ways that conveyed terror, frozen in the final moments. Daniel lay sprawled near a crevice, his face contorted, his hands reaching outward as though trying to fend off an invisible threat. Marco was half buried in powder, stiff and pale, eyes wide in panic. Lucas, the smallest of the three, had a broken neck, his body twisted unnaturally, as if dropped from a great height, landing atop a ledge that no human could have climbed or fallen from accidentally. Even stranger, all three were partially undressed despite temperatures plunging well below freezing, their outer layers ripped or missing entirely. Their tents found nearby were shredded to tatters, poles snapped and fabric torn, while backpacks and gear were scattered across the ridge in disordered arcs, some flung dozens of meters from the main camp. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Each bag still held clothing, food, and climbing equipment. But every item was strewn with such randomness that it suggested violence rather than carelessness. Sherpas assisting with the recovery, including Pemba Dorji, spoke of unusual findings in hushed, uneasy tones. The snow bore massive, elongated footprints pressed deep enough to sink nearly an inch into the compacted ice beneath, far larger than any human or even bear could produce. Even more unsettling, the prints veered sharply uphill at angles no climber could have walked, then disappeared into untouched snow, leaving no sign of retreat or descent. Nearby, rocks and ice had been displaced in arrangements that hinted at deliberate force, patterns too precise to be explained by falling debris or wind. Yet there was no sign of avalanche, landslide, or any natural disturbance capable of scattering the team and their equipment in such a way. The rescue team worked quickly to document the scene, photographing the strange footprints and mapping the spread of the debris, but time and weather conspired against them. Snowstorms swept in, and in the thin, rarefied air, each step required care and concentration. Even seasoned climbers found themselves uneasy, noting the oppressive silence that hung across the ridge and the occasional sound of ice cracking in ways that seemed too close to the team's previous positions to be coincidence. Authorities later issued an official report attributing the deaths to exposure, disorientation, and a sudden snowstorm that had struck without warning. They suggested hypothermia could explain the partial undressing, claiming that climbers sometimes remove layers during severe physiological stress, and dismissed the scattered gear as a consequence of panic in the storm. The bizarre tracks and displaced rocks were either ignored or described as misinterpretations caused by shifting ice or snow. Yet those present, especially Pemba and Tenzin, knew that nothing about the scene matched any storm-related accident they had ever seen. The prints, the angle of the tracks, the spread of debris, all of it hinted at the presence of something far larger, something capable of deliberate movement across snow and ice without leaving an obvious trace. Since that incident, climbers avoid that ridge entirely, choosing other paths despite the allure of a technical challenge and the prestige of conquering that section of the Himalayas. Guides speak quietly of shadows that move across the ice at night, of shapes that sweep silently through camps, of forms that vanish when approached, but leave the land rearranged in their wake. Even experienced mountaineers who have spent years in the Himalayas describe an unease in the high winds and the thinning air, a sense of being watched by something vast and patient, and few venture there after dusk or in early mornings when light is low and shadows are long. In the villages below, whispers persist. Pemba Dorje has recounted to trusted colleagues the way the tracks appeared impossibly large and impossibly steep, how the rocks seemed intentionally placed as if the ridge itself were being marked. Locals speak of creatures in the higher snowfields, massive beings that leave evidence without ever being seen, moving with intelligence, circling camps, and observing human activity before disappearing silently into the wind-swept heights. For those who knew Daniel, Marco, and Lucas, the tragedy is a permanent reminder that even the most skilled climbers are vulnerable in the Himalayas. But those who have examined the ridge closely know that this was unlike any ordinary accident. The scene speaks of force and intent, of a presence moving across the ice and snow with both power and intelligence, leaving devastation behind in a pattern that no snowstorm, no avalanche, and no human could replicate. On October 5th, 2017, the night in eastern Montana had already settled into the kind of cold darkness that seemed to swallow the sparse lights of small towns and gas stations along the highways, leaving stretches of road and parking lots in deep shadow. Liam Carter, a long-haul truck driver from Billings, was pulling his rig along a remote route between small, scattered towns, seeking a brief rest and fuel before the long drive into the mountains. The petrol station he chose was the kind locals avoided at night, a solitary outpost with cracked asphalt and flickering lights, perched at the edge of farmland and low hills, far from other travelers and entirely isolated once the last cars left for the evening. Liam maneuvered the 18-wheeler into a pump, noting the stillness of the place, the cold wind sweeping through the lot, carrying the faint scent of fuel and dry dirt. As he climbed down from the cab to refuel, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the lot, a dark shape shifting against the faint outlines of the nearby hills and scrub. His eyes adjusted to the dim illumination of the overhead lights, and he realized what he was seeing was unlike any person, animal, or shadow he had ever encountered. A towering silhouette stood partially hidden in darkness, broad and covered in thick, dark fur, its form impossibly tall, looming at least twice the height of a man, motionless yet somehow aware of his presence. The first instinct was disbelief. Liam froze, the nozzle in his hand, his gaze locked on the figure as it seemed to watch him patiently and without movement, as if assessing him in the area. Then, when he stepped closer, careful not to make sudden movements, the shape moved with a speed that defied reason, vanishing behind the pumps before he could fully track its motion. In the dim light, there was no trace of a person or vehicle, yet the ground betrayed evidence of something substantial. Beside the asphalt, in the soft dirt along the edge of the lot, Liam noticed a series of enormous footprints pressed deep into the earth. The prints were elongated, far too large to belong to a human. Each step sunk several inches into the soil, the toes splayed in a way he could not comprehend. They led in a line along the perimeter of the pumps, disappearing into darkness without a return path, as though whatever had left them had moved silently across the lot before vanishing into the surrounding shadows. Closer inspection revealed other anomalies. Along the edge of one of the pumps, a sticky dark fluid had been smeared across the metal base, glistening faintly under the flickering lights. Liam examined the ground and the nearby surfaces, noting the absence of tire marks, drag lines, or other evidence that might explain the smear. There were no spills from vehicles, no tools that could have left such marks, and no wildlife tracks that matched the substance or location. The mixture was unsettling, almost organic in appearance, and it clung stubbornly to the dirt and concrete. Despite his unease, Liam completed refueling and secured his truck, but he left the station shaken, his heart still racing from the encounter, his eyes scanning the tree line and the darkness beyond the lot, as though expecting the figure to emerge again. When he returned home the next day, he recounted the incident to the local authorities. They were polite but dismissive, attributing the tracks to a bear wandering into the area in search of food, and the sticky residue to spilled fuel or oil that had gathered dirt in the wind. They suggested pranksters might have staged the footprints and smear to scare travelers, emphasizing that there was no proof of anything extraordinary. But Liam knew what he had seen. Bears did not stand upright to such a height, did not move with deliberate, intelligent purpose, and certainly did not vanish behind pumps in seconds. Pranksters could not have left footprints with such deep impressions in soft dirt while disappearing without trace into darkness. And the sticky fluid, so fresh and so out of place, suggested that something had been there. Something physical, massive and aware. In the days that followed, fellow truckers who drove the same route confirmed their own unsettling observations. Some reported glimpsing enormous shadows along the roadside at night, shapes that moved quickly and silently, always at the edge of the light, never fully visible, yet large enough to cause an immediate sense of fear and presence. Others noted deep tracks near the station, disturbed dirt in circular patterns along the pumps, or fleeting glimpses of shapes disappearing into the hills as they passed. Over time, the station developed a reputation, whispered about in truck stops, diner conversations, and CB radio chatter. Drivers warned newcomers to avoid refueling there after dark, sharing cautionary tales of shadows and tracks that defied ordinary explanation. Liam himself never returned to that station. The memory of the figure, its towering height, and the deliberate, almost intelligent way it had moved across the lot, haunted him for weeks. He refused to stop at the same route, rerouting miles out of his way to avoid the lonely pumps, and he carried a quiet sense of vigilance on every subsequent night drive, scanning tree lines, side roads, and the edges of parking lots for the same presence he had encountered that October evening. Over time, the petrol station remained operational, but rarely saw visitors after dark. Locals and travelers alike spoke of it only in hushed tones, mentioning the strange occurrences at the pumps with a mix of fear and respect for the unseen. The shadow was described as patient, stalking in silence, observing activity without making a sound, moving with speed and power beyond comprehension, leaving behind only enormous prints and the occasional smear of strange substance on metal or soil. Those who had glimpsed it rarely spoke to outsiders directly, instead relying on rumor and subtle warnings to share the knowledge. Even years later, in 2021, stories persisted. Truckers passing through the stretch of highway recounted flickers of movement just beyond the reach of headlights, rustling in trees or bushes that should have been still, and the sense of being watched by something far larger than any human, something deliberate, something aware. The memory of that night in October 2017 remained alive in Liam Carter's mind. The image of the fur-covered figure and the deep, elongated prints engraved into his memory, a reminder that not all roads are safe, and some stretches of wilderness extend even into the parking lots of human civilization. The petrol station itself stands as a quiet, uneasy monument to that encounter. No lights can fully banish the darkness that creeps along the edges of the lot. No barrier can keep unseen eyes from watching. And those who venture near after nightfall carry the knowledge that something immense, intelligent, and elusive may be waiting, pacing silently in the shadows, leaving behind only footprints and fleeting, inexplicable signs of its presence. In late October 2016, when the ridges of southern Oregon were already thick with autumn fog, 3 hunters set out before dawn to scout a remote stretch of timbered ridge known for its elk and deer populations. Ethan Harper, a seasoned outdoorsman from Eugene, led the small group, accompanied by Ryan Caldwell, a hunter from Portland with years of experience in backcountry tracking, and Marcus Bell, a local guide familiar with the ridge's more treacherous trails. The fog was dense that morning, wrapping the forest in a gray, damp shroud, muting sound and making every movement appear distorted. Yet the trio pressed onward, rifles slung over their shoulders, boots crunching softly on the wet underbrush. They had been moving for hours when a low, guttural growl reverberated through the mist, rolling across the ridge in a way that made even Marcus, accustomed to the sounds of cougars and bears, stop mid-step. The hunters froze, hearts racing, scanning the gray haze for any movement. And then, through the shifting fog between the trees, they saw it, a massive, upright figure gliding silently across the slope, its form enormous and covered in dark, coarse fur, broad shoulders moving with an unsettling fluidity. Even at a distance, its presence radiated power, the kind that suggested both strength and intelligence. Panic gripped them. Ethan raised his rifle and instinctively, Ryan and Marcus followed suit. They fired into the fog, the report of their rifles cracking sharply in the still morning air. But the figure was gone before their shots could find it, disappearing into the mist as if it had never been there. For long moments, the ridge was silent again, the only sound the dripping of condensation from branches and the heavy breaths of the hunters, whose adrenaline surged as they realized how close they had come to encountering something beyond ordinary explanation. Shaken and unnerved, they returned to their truck at the edge of the ridge, the vehicle parked along a narrow dirt pull-off where the fog hung thick and low. They attempted to wait out the mist, sipping lukewarm coffee and keeping eyes fixed on the surrounding tree line. But the tension refused to dissipate. The fog lingered unnaturally, dense and static, and the hunter's sense of being observed intensified with every passing hour. By dawn, they discovered the aftermath of the night's visit. The truck was wrecked in a way that defied explanation. Tires were shredded, the roof dented with heavy, irregular impacts, and deep claw-like gouges ran across the hood, etched with a precision that suggested more than animal instinct. No tracks led to or from the truck, and the disturbed ground around the vehicle bore no evidence of footprints, tire marks, or any conventional passage. The hunters examined the ridge in disbelief, trying to rationalize the damage, but nothing in their experience with bears, cougars, or even human vandals could explain the careful, deliberate destruction. The gouges were too straight in places, the dents too concentrated, the shredded tires placed as though an immense force had tested them one by one. Rangers investigating the scene attributed the destruction to bears, citing the fog and isolation as complicating factors, and emphasized that black and grizzly bears were capable of surprising strength and destructive behavior. Yet even they could not explain the absence of tracks, the precision of the dents and scratches, or the way the vehicle seemed targeted in a pattern that suggested observation and intent rather than random aggression. The three hunters left the ridge that morning with a mixture of disbelief, fear, and lingering adrenaline, vowing never to return under similar conditions, and the ridge remained quiet for weeks. Though locals whispered about what had transpired, word spread among hunters in surrounding counties. Those familiar with the ridge passed warnings quietly, emphasizing the dangers of foggy mornings, of wandering alone, and of leaving vehicles unattended. They spoke of a massive figure seen moving silently, returning night after night to the same spots, as if following invisible patterns of observation. Some claimed that in certain conditions, when the fog rolled thick, it was possible to hear the low exhalations of the creature, guttural and deliberate, echoing across the slopes, and then in the next moment, to see a shadow vanish, as if it had melted into the mist itself. Ethan, Ryan, and Marcus each carried their memories differently. Ethan, reflective and cautious, avoided the ridge entirely, choosing to hunt elsewhere despite the prime conditions. Ryan, who often recounted the story to trusted friends, admitted to sleepless nights after that encounter, haunted by the image of the towering figure and the sense of its silent intelligence. Marcus, whose familiarity with the ridge was unmatched, spoke only in cautious terms, warning newcomers to trust their instincts and avoid traveling in fog, emphasizing that some things in the forest were neither bear nor man, and that survival often depended on recognizing the presence of something beyond ordinary understanding. The ridge itself has remained largely undisturbed since that morning in October 2016. Hunters occasionally report fleeting glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows shifting against the gray mist, and the occasional sound, a low growl or the snap of a branch, carried by the wind in a way that makes even the most experienced tracker pause. Rangers continue to insist the damage to vehicles and gear is the work of black bears, wind, or human mischief. But locals and frequent visitors know better, understanding that intelligence, patience, and sheer size are evident in the pattern of destruction. Over the years, the fog has become more than a weather pattern in the minds of those who traverse the ridge. It has become a harbinger, a signal that conditions are right for observation, that the forest is alive in ways the human eye rarely perceives. The figure, whether it is truly Bigfoot or another cryptid, seems drawn to these conditions, moving with deliberate purpose, returning to the same spots where humans have left traces of their presence, and disappearing as quickly as it appears, leaving behind only damage, impressions, and an unnerving sense of awareness. Those who venture into the fog on the Oregon Ridge do so with caution. They move deliberately, scan constantly, and avoid stopping near vehicles or campsites once visibility is limited. Even experienced hunters report a subtle change in the forest during thick fog, a sensation of weight and attention that is difficult to describe, and a persistent unease that something watches from the gray haze. For Ethan, Ryan, and Marcus, the memory of that night remains vivid, a reminder that in certain conditions, in certain places, the forest is ruled not by the predictable instincts of known wildlife, but by something far larger, patient, and capable of observing without being seen.